and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week, we're going to take a hard look at an issue that should be top of the mind for every policymaker and indeed citizen of India, but unfortunately hasn't come in for the attention it deserves. We're going to take a hard look at job creation and the challenge of providing jobs for our youngsters in a scenario where automation is threatening to take away even the few jobs that are being created today. Every month, 1 million people are estimated to be joining the workforce. But when it comes to jobs, only a minuscule fraction of new jobs are being created. So what is the way out? How do we ensure that our famed democratic dividend does not become a demographic liability? And who better to answer that question than two of the most knowledgeable heads on this issue, the subjects. I have with me Kiran Karnik, formerly with ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, and former president NASSCOM, the trade association of IT in India, who knows technology like the back of his hand. I also have with me Manish Sabharwal, chairman TeamLease Services, who is as much of a pro on the employment issues and is hence a perfect foil for Kiran on this subject. Welcome to the show, Kiran, Manish. Let me start by asking both of you something that has puzzled me all along. Job creation was high on this government's agenda. There was a promise of creating something like 10 million jobs a year. But 3 years down the line, we have very little to show by way of job creation. Just last week, the PM met with senior officials to find out why there's been so little progress. So let me ask you, what is your take on that? Let me start with you, Kiran, and then I'll go to Manish.
You know, I think times are changing and we are not. Jobs that we are looking for example, in manufacturing is yet to move ahead more rapidly, but even when it does, I don't see it as the job creation engine that people imagine it to be. As I said, times have changed. We've got to adapt. We've got to look for new places for jobs, new ways of creating jobs, new sectors, new technologies, and new areas. And to me, the job creation is going to be much more in sectors other than manufacturing as we look ahead, with automation going the way it is.
So, Manish, would you agree with Kiran that we have to look elsewhere? And you once spoke of the importance of what you called sequencing, proportioning, demonstrating, communicating, and decentralizing. You said, and I quote over here, sequencing is important because equating labor reforms with liberalizing hire and fire restrictions ignores the many other laws that currently inhibit formal, non-formal employment. Proportioning is important because progress is much more important than perfection, and thresholds in labor laws can be raised once they are touched. What does that mean? Can you explain that in simple English for our viewers, Manish?
Essentially, my case is that India doesn't have a jobs problem, we have a wages problem. So if you think India's unemployment rate is a fudge, I don't believe it's a fudge. I believe everybody who wants a job has a job. They just don't have the wages they want or they need. I think that distinction is important, because if you think that the problem is jobs, you'll have NREGS, which is, you know, give people money to dig holes and fill them up. But if you think the problem is wages, then you'll think about productivity, which is formalization, urbanization, human capital, industrialization, and so they're sort of longer term. I think, you know, 15 years ago when we started TeamLease, everybody who came to our job fairs used to say, "Kahin naukri dila do, kisi bhi dila do." Now people say, "Ki naukri to hai." 75% of people have a job at 3,000 or 5,000. They're looking for 8,000 or 10,000. So naukri and achhi naukri are two different problems. And my submission is that India's policy objective should be formalization rather than jobs, because our unemployment rate is not a fudge. People who want jobs have a job, they just don't have the wages. The problem of working poor is different from pure solving unemployment.
Kiran, would you agree with Manish that yes, jobs are perhaps being created, and he says that jobs are available if you are not so particular about wages, but should we not also think in terms of what kind of jobs, what is the minimum wage that people get? After all, a job of 3,000 cannot really make both ends meet. And coming to this particular topic that I'm talking about, automation and jobs, Manish, in a recent article, had pointed out that only 0.7% and 11% of India's labour force works in IT and manufacturing. So it would be wrong to say that employment in these two sectors is really peaked. On the contrary, there's much more scope in these sectors as well in a country which has got low income, low productivity like India. And he was willing to wager that in 5 years hence, IT employment would rise from this current 3.5 million to 6 million, and in 10 years, manufacturing employment would rise from 10% to 20% of the labour force. Would you agree that we're only at a fraction of the employment potential in these two sectors? Trump notwithstanding, jobs will rise, not only in absolute terms, as also a share of the workforce, and also the wages will improve. Would you agree, Kiran, or is that much too optimistic a view?
Well, as far as these two sectors that you mentioned, Mythili, are concerned, I agree, and the IT part certainly, 6 million, exactly when, I don't know, but very soon. I think the prospects for more jobs, despite automation, despite artificial intelligence, is yet there because the growth and the headroom for growth is very substantial, and we will continue to need people. It's not going to be as fast as it was, but even in the last 1 year, 170,000 jobs added in the IT sector, direct jobs. Manufacturing, I'm not as optimistic as Manish is, because manufacturing tends to get automated at the bottom end, and that's where most of the jobs are. So yes, again, there will be growth, but not the kind of growth that we are seeing. But both these sectors, let's keep in mind, in terms of India's population and the demographics in terms of the working age population, are never going to be huge absorbers. We've just got to look at rural non-farm employment. And there, technology is creating an impact, because as farms mechanize, very slowly, truly, but as they mechanize, jobs are going to go. As it is, there's disguised unemployment. As Manish has said, yes, in a way he's right, that it's a wages problem. The wages sometimes are so trivial as to not mean anything. And the unemployment rate effectively in rural India is definitely very high. Unless we can begin to tackle that problem, part of it is migration, part of it, the more important part to me, is the challenge of how do you create rural non-farm jobs. And unless we begin to tackle that, I don't think we're going to be able to take care of people in terms of where we need jobs.
And Manish, though Kiran agrees with you on the fact that we're nowhere near our potential in terms of employment in IT, and he's not so hopeful about manufacturing, you are much more hopeful. But most manufacturers will tell you that they're already going into automation in a big way, as it saves them all the hassles of dealing with labor, especially in a complex legal framework. So how will we generate more jobs? Remember, it's not enough to generate jobs. You also need to be able to find people with the right skills. So what makes you so optimistic, Manish?
Well, I think a few things, right? So manufacturing, the peak of any country was Britain in World War II, which was 45% of the labor force. The US peaked at 33%, and China peaked at 28% of its labor force. I don't make the case that India will ever get to 45, 33, or 28%. But I think 11% is the same as post-industrial United States. I would also submit that Make in India, maybe Make for India. So if you look at the $63 billion of FDI which came in last year, most of it is clustered in manufacturing for where domestic markets are getting to critical size, whether it's washing machines, whether it's cars, whether it's FMCG and stuff like that. So, you know, we'll be more like America than China. I mean, China has 55% of its GDP which are exports. We are about 20-25% of our GDP which is exports. So I don't think exports and manufacturing are things that we have to give up on. Of course, domestic consumption is going to be a big driver of our job market. But the question, as Kiran is saying, is it going to be rural non-farm employment or non-farm employment? Because do you take jobs to people or people to jobs? India has 600,000 villages. 200,000 of those villages have less than 200 people. So I think the more important problem for India is we have only 45 cities with more than 1 million people, while China has 375 cities with more than 1 million people. So whether in political imagination we are always taking jobs to people, but I think you'll have to bring people to jobs, and that's where this whole wage question comes, because we've had bad urbanization. We've had a lot of urbanization, but there's been a massive divergence between real wages and nominal wages. So I had a kid in a job fair in Gwalior tell me, give me 4,000 rupees in Gwalior, 6,000 rupees in Gurgaon, 9,000 rupees in Delhi, and 18,000 rupees in Bombay. My bags are packed, tell me where you want me to go. Now people may view this as sort of, oh, what is the quality of living, but it's 4 times more, and he's okay with 4,000 rupees in Gwalior. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about absolute salaries, because he's fine with 4. When I asked him, why do you need 4 times more money to go to Bombay, he said, जितने बच्चे 10,000 में Bombay गए थे सब वापस आ गए, खाना रहना और ऑफिस जाना नहीं बनता है. So he's not asking for a salary, he's asking for reimbursement, right? True. And so the real wages versus nominal wages is obviously an important question for India, and I think that domestic consumption, so our economy will look more like the US than China, while in our political imagination we're always trying to be China.
No, I assure you, Manish, nobody would mind being like the US, because all said and done the US is far richer. But as you said, the question is really of taking people to jobs. Kiran, my question is, Are restrictive labor laws responsible for this kind of situation, for the poor job creation? And if so, the fact is that labor reform has always been seen as a political hot potato. So for all the talk of reform by the central government, it's been quite content to leave it to the states on the ground that it's part of the concurrent list. And we've seen Rajasthan has made some efforts in labor reform, but very few of the other states have followed. Quite unlike in the case of farm loan waiver, where the states are quite happy to follow a bad egg. They are very reluctant to do this when it comes to politically sensitive issues like labor reform. So what really is the way out?
Well, before I answer that, Mythili, just a comment on the China-US thing. And again, I find myself in complete agreement with Manish, not so much in the imagination of how wealthy we might be or how much we consume or how we consume, but in terms of where we are heading. And this is my worry, because most of our policymakers love the China model. Create a SEZ and we will open up everything and we will have huge investments and huge manufacturing and huge jobs. That was 30 years ago. Times have changed, I repeat, we are not in that world, and therefore we need to look differently. But to your point on labor reforms, everything that I have seen tells me that labor reforms are important, but they are not the holding factor. They are not the only ones responsible for lack of job creation. It's good to do some of them, and many states, as you said, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra have moved ahead, but just making a job hire and fire environment is not going to be enough. There are lots of other factors that need to go in, and incidentally, most of the labor reforms relate to manufacturing kind of activities. And to the extent some of them produce, a result in flexibility, it is important. But again, I want to repeat what I said earlier, that such flexibility is most welcome, most desirable, maybe even necessary, but it has to be backed with some kind of social security net. To do it without that would not be development. It might mean economic growth, but it would not mean development.
We'll have the same kind of jobless growth as we're having at the moment, but I'm afraid it's time for us now to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing how does one create jobs and what does automation mean for job creation in India. And I'm talking with Manish Sabharwal and Kiran Karnik. Manish, before the break, I was asking Kiran about labor reform. And the fact is that we've seen a number of reforms in the labor area. Amendments have been made to various labor legislations, but none of these has really borne fruit in terms of additional jobs being created. Is it because there's a gestation period, or is it because these reforms are just totally inadequate for the kind of change that we need to see in the labor arena? Manish?
Labor laws don't create jobs, they create more formal jobs. And I will submit to you that 1.3 crore extra Provident Fund payers have come in the last 3 years, and 1 crore extra ESI payers have come. So ESI has gone from 17 million to 27 million, and EPFO has gone from 34 million to 47 million. These are not new jobs, I'm not making that claim, but these are new formal jobs. So I think that it's important to sort of, I frame the problem as good jobs versus jobs. If you say the problem is jobs, I don't think we have a problem. Formal jobs are people which pay PF, ESI, or have a Form 16. So my submission is, this narrative that India is 90% informal employment is wrong. India is at about 75 to 80% informal employment. If you total up the number of people who pay PF, ESI, get a Form 16 and work for government employment and deduplicate them, you'll end up with 70 to 90 million people. Numbers are always tough in the labor markets in India, but India is at about 75 to 80% formal employment. And I think whenever we all use this labor market data, we must be very clear that we are all sort of groping in the dark, because 27% of Indian households say that they work for an enterprise with more than 9 employees, but only 1.5% of Indian enterprises say they have more than 9 employees. Now, this is not a trivial difference between the demand and supply side, which actually should match. So I would submit that we are creating jobs, we're not creating good jobs. What does good jobs need? Good jobs need more formalization. Our 60 million enterprises, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 8.5 million have a GST registration, only 1.3 million enterprises pay Provident Fund. So we need more formal enterprises and less overall enterprises. The US economy is 8 times our size and it only has 22 million enterprises. So it's clear that we need more formalization. We need more cities with more than 1 million people, and we need more human capital. Schools, skills, higher education reform is absolutely overdue and urgent, and we need some radical reform in that. So good jobs agenda is a completely different thought world than just create jobs. agenda, which I think we've been peddling for 10, 15, 20 years and hasn't worked for India.
Absolutely. Good jobs, but good jobs also mean a certain amount of social security, which unfortunately is missing, except at the very, the middle to top end. At the lower end, there virtually is none, even in what we call the so-called formal sector. And Kiran, this is what worries us, because in a scenario where the GDP growth has been falling and export growth, though better than before, is unlikely to improve dramatically given where world growth is going, where will we find the jobs? And if I remember right, you were a member of the Central Board of the Directors of the RBI, like Manish is now. You were a member during the time when we were transitioning to an inflation targeting regime. So was there ever any discussion about the need to focus also on job creation at the RBI Central Board?
Well, I won't say what was discussed there, Mythili, it won't be correct and won't be fair. But all I can tell you is that job creation and employment is certainly a very, very important thing in this country, as in many, many other countries. But at the same time, I want to stress that controlling inflation, to me, is a very important part of what we need to do. Every time you have high inflation, those who suffer the most are those who are the poorest. This is a very obvious thing, and in that, those who suffer most are those who, Manish has put it very well, the formal jobs, the good jobs, versus those who are not not inflation indexed. I mean, people who are inflation indexed don't care what the inflation is, frankly. It does affect them, but not that much. What about everybody else? And therefore, to me, the industry clamor for reducing the interest rates is understandable, and maybe it will act as a bit of stimulus to the economy. But let's not forget that a vast majority of our population would suffer tremendously if inflation goes up by 2 or 3 percentage points. I mean, you're just going to find this even socially unsustainable, leave alone the economic and human impact of it. Therefore, I would strongly defend focus on keeping inflation where we need to. But yes, in addition, you can't have a single point maximization in such a case. You do need to keep in mind that how do you do that along with employment, and I don't think the two are orthogonal. I don't think there's necessarily a trade-off. I do think you can do both together wisely, but we need to keep both in mind true. But please don't slam the inflation control, because lots of people in industry just love that, and for whatever reason the government seems to think it's a great idea. Every time the inflation goes up, the government will go out, I can tell you.
That is true. Inflation is, in fact, a bigger political hot potato. But the fact is, what inflation? 3%, 4%, 5%. And Manish, now that you are where Kiran was, I wonder whether you will also try and get the RBI to look a little bit at growth, which most people feel right now the RBI is focusing a bit too much on a very rigid inflation targeting. But my question really to you now is that, we spoke about how manufacturing cannot be the answer. So can services really become the new manufacturing? Terms like care economy in view of rising longevity, the gig economy, which shows up independent work opportunities, are becoming increasingly common. Can these be the answer to a country like India?
That's why I said India will be more like the US. I mean, the US is a service economy where people are serving each other, healthcare, education.
Okay.
There are all kinds of services which provide jobs, and that country has got to a per capita income of $45,000. So India is at $1,500. Will we get to $45,000? Maybe not. We can get to $8,000 with a domestic consumption-driven economy if we do the radical reform in the factors of production, land, labor, capital. Frankly, in India, the birth defect in our labor markets is that 50% of our labor force in agriculture only produces 12% of our GDP. This is a structural problem. This has got nothing to do with monetary and fiscal policy. In fact, monetary and fiscal policy cannot do the farm to non-farm transition. China's genius was taking 300 million people off farms. The only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. And yes, China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India's farm to non-farm is happening to sales, not even to services. I mean, the fastest growing segment of India's job market is sales, customer service and logistics, which is domestic consumption. So if we improve the productivity of the Indian economy by reforming land, labor, capital, I don't think anything can stop us to get from $1,500 to $8,000 per median household income. Let's say that's a better sort of measure of prosperity. And so we do need, I must reiterate that I do think there's a lot of regulatory cholesterol still in land, labor, capital, which is important to raise productivity and create the good jobs India needs. And that will take difficult decisions in land, labor, capital, some of which we've made, some long-term stuff we've done, but there is a lot still yet to be done.
Oh, absolutely. I think there is a lot of, as you call, regulatory cholesterol, more in labor and land than in capital. But Kiran, One of the ironies really is that over the years, labour force participation has actually been falling, and presently it's barely over 50%. And the usual explanation that I've seen for this is that women are opting out of employment as they become more prosperous, people are studying longer, etc. But I'm not entirely convinced with this argument. After all, we're talking about a country where, I don't know about you, but speaking for myself, I simply don't have the luxury of not working. So what to your mind is the reason why labour participation rates are so low and falling?
Well, we know that the data doesn't always tell us the true, correct or full story. So I'm not sure. Yes, there's speculation, a little bit of studies that seem to indicate that it is increasing awareness or even increasing prosperity that's taken women out of the workforce, and education. I'm not so sure of that. But I want to just address for a moment the other point that was made about services, and I completely agree with the point that was made that future jobs are going to be much more in the service sector, and it's time we focused much more strongly on that. Somehow, most of our policy makers, not just now, but for the last 10 years, have got caught up with this dream manufacturing story. This is not to put down manufacturing. We're a large country, there's strategic needs, there are possibilities there, we do have some advantages, but that's not our strength, nor is that the future employment, nor is there much value addition there now. We need to look at services far more strongly, and therefore, once you begin to look at that, one more factor which comes in both in manufacturing and services, Manish mentioned land labor capital. Yes, these are true. But today, to me, the most important driver, additional driver of growth is going to be technology. And I think we need as much or more focus on that as we have placed on land labor capital.
But you don't think, Kiran, that technology is going to displace people from jobs? So is it a net plus or a net minus, Kiran?
Well, it displaces some people and recruits other people. I mean, when IT first came, I yet remember people saying that, when I remember the banking industry, for example, when computers first came, the unions were aghast and everybody thought jobs are going to go. Look at the number of jobs created in the IT sector, and incidentally, look at the job growth in the banking sector. That tells you the story that technology makes life difficult for individuals because you've got to rescale, your skill may not be valued, you may be obsolete, but overall, experience through the last centuries, if not certainly the last few decades, is that it creates more jobs than it takes away.
Okay, so we don't need to fear technology. That really is your message. But Manish, will growth automatically lead to more jobs, or does job creation need specific action, particularly from the government? Because if you look at poverty, for example, it's quite dramatic. It fell most after reforms when growth picked up compared to the pre-reform days when we had so many specific programs targeted poverty reduction. Likewise, will jobs automatically follow growth, or does the government have to do something to incentivize job creation? Manish?
Well, I think you've already started seeing the move in fiscal policy, right? For years or decades, we've given people fiscal incentives based on how much they invest in capital amounts, but a power plant will build 40 jobs. But if you think of ATJJJ, which gives many companies a huge tax rebate for employees who pay provident fund, which are hired. Now the government has just announced that they will cover the employee pension scheme payments for the first 3 years for new employment. So I think incentives for labor intensive industries have already begun to be experimented both at a central level, and Haryana is now doing it at a state level. But my sense is that, it's clear a job changes a life in a way that no subsidy ever can. Services are an important part. So India is a hostile habitat for entrepreneurship. If you reduce the regulatory cholesterol, if you improve the infrastructure, and if you improve human capital, the role of the government isn't setting things on fire. It is creating the conditions for spontaneous combustion. I think they can do some things, but if you make India less hostile for entrepreneurship, I am quite optimistic that Indians will respond, firms will grow larger, and jobs will become more formal. If you build the infrastructure so we don't have to substitute for the state, if you reduce the regulatory cholesterol so we don't get dragged behind the car of every inspector, and if you improve human capital so productivity automatically will go up, which is stuff like replacing the Right to Education Act with the Right to Learning Act. I mean, school, the K-12, in the new world of work, reading, writing, arithmetic, and soft skills are the most important skills. So the Right to Education Act confuses school buildings with building schools. We need Right to Learning Act. So there's a lot to be done, but I don't believe this is impossible, and if a government has the courage and the will to do it, I mean, they've done GST and demonetization. All these reforms seem pedestrian compared to the risk taken during demonetization. So I'm confident that they might get it done.
Absolutely, Kiran. I'll give you the last word. Very quickly, would you agree with Manish that the government really doesn't have much to do to create jobs? It just needs to be an enabler. Is that enough?
Absolutely. You know, people want jobs. You don't have to create jobs. And, you know, if you create the enabling conditions, infrastructure particularly, even that, the government doesn't have to create it, they have to stimulate it and create the right environment where people have the freedom to go out and do stuff themselves. I think, yes, very much you find jobs coming in.
Absolutely. That's what the government role is everywhere, whether we're talking about airline privatization, bank privatization, just enable. But I'm afraid we've run out of time completely, so I must end this discussion now. Even though I think we've been able to give our viewers perhaps only a flavor of the complexity of the issues here. Thank you very much, Manish and Kiran, for joining me in this discussion and also for your excellent suggestions that I do hope the government will heed. The reality is that when it comes to jobs, we're really sitting on a volcano, and it's time we realize the gravity of the situation. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at TT Now. Remember, if there's any issue you would like to see discussed in this program, do write in to us at the mail ID you see at the bottom of your screen.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/etnow.